Whether you're outside grilling, changing diapers, or just trying to catch a breath, the Young Dad Podcast is your spot for real conversations about fatherhood, manhood, and everything in between. I'm your host, Jay, and I sit down with dads, experts, and everyday men to talk about the joys, the struggles, and the lessons that come with raising kids and building a meaningful life. From mental health and relationships to faith, family, and the funny stuff only dads understand, YDP is here to remind you that you're not doing this alone. So grab a juice box, grab a snack, kick back, and join the conversation because fatherhood doesn't come with a manual, but it should come with a podcast. Sometimes the stories that break you are the same ones that build you. Today's guest knows that better than anyone. He's buried a child and survived an avalanche he caused himself, and both moments brought him to face with God. From a full-term stillbirth that shattered his world to a mountaintop miracle that saved his life, he's learned what it really means to trust when everything feels lost. This one's about fatherhood, faith, and the kind of redemption only pain can write. So whether you're outside grilling, mowing the lawn, changing dirty diapers, or maybe you finally got that moment to sit down, relax, and put your favorite podcast up on YouTube on the TV, thanks for being here, and thanks for telling a friend. Today's guest is Mick, a storyteller, husband, father, and host of the When You Look show. He's known for his raw, real storytelling, but it's the stories behind his words that move people most. After losing his firstborn son Luke to a full-term stillbirth, Mick and his wife cried out to God, discovered what they thought was a Luke-shaped hole in their heart was really a God-shaped one. 18 months later, their daughter was born. 7 years later, twin boys. And somewhere in between, Mick survived an avalanche that should have killed him. So make sure you grab your juice box, grab a snack, and let's jump into today's conversation with Mick. And of course, welcome him to the show. Welcome, Mick.
Hey, Jay. Thanks a bunch for having me, man. Great to be here, truly.
Of course, I'm excited to talk to you. I don't think this is, well, when it comes to Luke and the avalanche, I don't think I've talked to anyone that's ever been through either of those things. So I guess kind of take us back to maybe before Luke, when you guys were pregnant and all the things, and just kind of the story before, and just walk us through from there.
Yeah, man. Thanks for the opportunity to do that, truly, because it's quite an interesting and unique story that God has written in our lives. So let's rewind to me being in my late 20s and early 30s as an ego-fueled, illy, energy-filled guy trying to climb the corporate ladder. And my wife and I, we got married when I was 25. She was 26. And Jay, we were really purposeful. And I'm going to choose my language here on purpose to kind of get into the backstory. But we were really purposeful about being married without kids. And then later, it became time from our perspective that now we were going to start a family. It was like our time, our decision, we're going to now start a family. And so we knew many folks who had challenges getting pregnant. We certainly were aware of the fact that that could be the case for us, but we were able to get pregnant literally right away. And in April of 2011, we are pregnant and, with our first child. And we later found out that that was a little boy and his name was Luke. And so as a new dad, young dad at that point, I'm going to all of the obstetrics appointments at the beginning because, everybody's pumped and excited about this. And then, in the middle term, you're kind of like, I'm good. Maybe I don't need to miss work as much. And then I ended up going to the OB appointment. That was kind of the last one prior to Luke's due date. Luke's due date was January 11th of 2002. So we're at this OB appointment. Everything is, they're doing their last ultrasound checks and all the normal stuff that we would expect. I'm largely there on the sidelines. And as we were wrapping up, I said to the doctor, I was like, anything we should be thinking about here? It sure seems like everything's kind of good, but anything that we should be aware of? And her response to me was, you guys are good to go. Your wife should be on the cover of Fit Pregnancy magazine. And Jay, the reason why I bring that up and the reason why I remember that, okay, is because of what I was talking about a few moments ago, which is that I was this ego-fueled young guy, okay, not really an adult, even though I was 6 feet tall and 31 years old. And so I can remember her saying that because if somebody says to you, your wife should be on the cover of Fit Pregnancy magazine, that signals the fact that, okay, things are probably good to go, you know what I mean, from the health of your baby, but also that your wife is attractive enough to be on the cover of a magazine. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I'm not saying any of this boastfully now. What I'm saying is that that is an indication of the type of person that I was. Okay. And so we are now a handful of days before his due date, and I go to walk our dogs because we live in a townhouse and I had to walk our dogs. I come back in from walking our dogs on the morning of January 4th, and my wife is standing in the kitchen crying. And I'm like, honey, what's up? And she says, I haven't felt him move since last night. So obviously that was a problem. We called the doula that we had a relationship with and that we were going to be using for the delivery. She says, go to the hospital. Don't go to the ER, but go specifically to labor and delivery. And so, Jay, we go in there. It's 3 different ultrasound techs, 3 different ultrasound machines, and one MD who finally says what at that point we all really knew, which was, hey, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your baby no longer has a heartbeat. So we are 1 week away from his due date. We are 39 weeks gestationally, and we find out that our first baby is dead in my wife's womb. And that overwhelmed us with grief, essentially immediately. My wife was also in a bit of panic mode. And I say this with all due respect to her because now she's like, I have a dead baby inside of me. I want to get that dead baby out. So she's like, I need to go to the bathroom. So I walk with her to the bathroom. We've all had that experience of, a hospital bathroom with that gigantic door. And it's this huge room. Like you can park a dump truck in it, but it's only got one toilet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so she goes into the restroom. I close the door. I'm outside in the hallway, and I am so completely overwhelmed with grief that I am now physically on my knees, and my face is 6 inches away from that linoleum floor. And I just cried out to God, man. I cried out to God because what was abundantly clear to me at this point in life, Jay, was that I have been a very capable man. Okay. And what I mean by that is like I was good with my hands. I was able to fix the car, fix things around the house. I had a lot of energy, a lot of intellect. And so I was able to solve problems at work. And in general, up to this point in life, I have been able to, with tenacity or grit, or a little bit of help from somebody else, I've been able to solve every problem I've ever come up against. And it was abundantly clear to me in those moments that this was completely beyond me. There was nothing I could do. And so it was in desperation that I cried out to God because I knew that this was fully beyond me. And that's when my wife and I ultimately entered into relationship with God. And as you mentioned in the intro, man, over the subsequent months of grief, we very much thought that we had this Luke-shaped hole in our hearts. And God was comforting us in all of that grief and helped me in particular to see that not only could we not replace Luke, but that we didn't have a Luke-shaped hole in our hearts. We very much had a God-shaped hole in our hearts and a Jesus-shaped hole in our hearts. And he filled that hole, man. He loved us through all of that. And as a result of every bit of that, he's changed the trajectory of our lives forever and changed the trajectory of our children's lives, our living children's lives forever too.
It's amazing. And so, kind of to dig in a little bit here, I'm curious because I think there's an important part here to dive into a little bit around this. So, after she delivers the baby, you guys leave the hospital back to normal life. What were those conversations like with people around you, friends, family, coworkers, and stuff? People you shared your excitement with, and then they'll think, "Oh, well, I haven't seen you for a little bit. Did your wife have the baby?" Kind of thing, and a lot of those reminders. So, how did you guys handle those conversations?
Yeah, man, those were a mixed bag of challenges. Because word spread pretty fast through the folks that we knew that Luke was dead. But at the same time, people then didn't really know how to handle that. And so good friends were understandably, like, we have a lot of empathy, we have a lot of compassion for them with this, okay? Because most people have never gone through anything even remotely close to this. Many people, and we fully respect that many people have lost babies in utero, miscarriages, and those types of things. But, not that many folks have encountered full-term stillbirth. I mean, my wife delivers a 6-pound, 8-ounce, 21-inch long dead baby, you know what I mean, vaginally. So, like, it's a big deal, and not a lot of people, even our really close friends, knew how to handle that. So we've realized that there was some distance. And so what we tried to do in those instances was let people know it's totally okay to talk about this, and that the grief that we're experiencing is our grief, and there's nothing you can do about it, meaning you can't actually add to our grief. So in fact, talking about it helps us with our grief. So it's no problem at all for you to ask questions that you're just even curious about, like, how are you guys handling this? Or what was he like? Or what did he look like? Because to your point, Jay, we had a full 24 hours with Luke in labor and delivery. You know what I mean? So even though he's dead, we got to swaddle him, we got to cuddle with him. And that was a really helpful part of the healing process. So we experienced a lot of folks that didn't exactly know what to say. And we did our best to try and, be as gracious as we could with that.
Yeah, and I think that's, like, probably the hardest thing in that moment is to have grace for other people. You just because I would think in that moment, you would just want people to understand. You would just want them to just get it and be able to help and comfort and things like that, but at the same time, you mentioned, like, you realize, like, a lot of people around you never experienced this, and so you have to, like, have grace with them. But I think the great thing that you guys did was communicate those things about, like, from your guys' perspective, instead of saying, "No, no, don't talk about it." Actually, let's do talk about it because that actually helps us. That helps me, right? Or, ask me those questions because, like, that helps me kinda thing, right? So, and that I think is a really good takeaway here is being able to understand, like, even though you're experiencing something maybe others haven't gone through, and you have to realize, like, they haven't gone through it, and so you do need to communicate what you need at the same time, even though it can be really hard. You don't wanna do that. You have to do that so that you can get the help and the comfort that you need from those around you that are offering it freely and from a genuine place. So I think that's really cool that you guys were able to do that.
Yeah. And we had to do a lot of that with each other as well. So just to a quick add there, one of the things that really helped my wife and I with our grief was we agreed that we were going to let each other grieve individually, and or maybe better said, have our own versions of grief. Naturally, we were grieving together. Do you know what I mean? But there would be days or moments where my wife might be in, we'll call, like a good day. You know what I mean? And I might be having a quote unquote bad day in terms of, like, lots of grief. And so we agreed very early on that grief was really individual and that we were going to let the other person grieve in their own way, meaning we didn't want one person to get to a spot, wherever that spot or whenever that spot might have been, where it was like, okay, now it's time for you to move on. You know what I mean? We wanted each person to be able to grieve in their own individual way. And I used that term move on here just a second ago, because that was kind of another thing that we also decided we're not going to use that language because we just don't think it's appropriate. We're not going to ever move on from this. We decided that we were going to move forward, meaning it was always going to be with us. It was impossible for us to leave this behind because it was a part of our lives, but then we had to figure out, okay, how do we move forward as opposed to how do we move on, which kind of implied we're going to disconnect from this as if it never happened.
Yeah, no, and that was gonna be kinda where I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's, something I wanted to ask you about is how you guys did move on, move forward, to use your language here, move forward, like, after this, because 18 months, that's really, 9 months before getting pregnant again, and that's a really short amount of time, but I think something that does help is that at this time, you guys are both, what, 26, 27, or 28,
No, we're
29?
31, 32 at this point.
31, 32. Okay, so you
Yeah.
guys, I think that helps a lot being a little bit older, right? You guys both have fully developed brains, um, and stuff, and so I really think that helps being a little bit older, being able to have a little bit more perspective and a little bit more maturity, to be able to process this in that very mature way that you guys did, being able to let each other grieve, communicate that clearly with others, and getting those skills from like, because imagine if this had happened if you were, 7 to 10 years younger, right? 24,
Hmm.
25 would have been totally different had this
Absolutely.
happened. Would have been a total disassociation, and just huge difference, in everything. And plus, you guys had been married for a good amount of time by then too. So you guys knew each other, and so I think all those things are really, obvious contributing factors here. But how did you guys move forward after that? Because I mean, 9 months is not a lot of time after giving birth to a stillborn and then going through grief and essentially burying him. A year and a half later, she's giving birth again. What
Yeah, so there's some neat stuff in between there, which I think is really
Definitely.
what you're getting at. So, the first thing is that we did a lot of grieving together, and what that looked like was a lot of prayer. So as I mentioned, right, we're on the floor, I'm on the floor in the hospital, and that's really when I cried out and began a relationship with God. The rubber was meeting the road with that in the middle of the night. I mean, we'd be awakened by the grief 1 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, just totally overwhelmed, one of us or the other, sometimes even both of us kind of waking up at the same time. And so we would just lay in bed and we would hold hands and we would pray. And the prayers were raw, man, raw on purpose, because we're already raw, like we're already totally just filleted open and broken and hurting. There's no reason to like whitewash our prayers. You know what I'm saying? And so we just continued to cry out. And it wasn't crying out like, God, why did you do this? It was just help us heal. We know it's done. You know what I mean? We wouldn't have chosen this. We believed you chose it. And all of that was just his grace and kind of this instantaneous. Okay, we understood that this was his will, not ours, even though we didn't have any relationship going into any of that. But we grieved together all throughout the day. And as I mentioned here just a moment ago, a lot of that was in the middle of the night. And, I mentioned earlier as well this idea of, we thought that we had a Luke shaped hole in our hearts. Well, right after we were green lighted for intimacy again, so 6 weeks after Luke is delivered, I'm like, we got to get pregnant again. And we did. And 8-ish weeks in on that pregnancy, we miscarried. And that was a loss for us. But truthfully, man, and this is with respect to everybody that's had, multiple miscarriages and those types of things, we're very respectful of that. That loss of that baby was just completely enveloped in Luke's loss. It wasn't its own separate thing. Like we were just kind of grieving everything. And so it's just truly kind of rolled into all of that for us. But my wife really wisely, Jay, she's like, hey, man, we got to put the brakes on this. We need to heal. And it was in that time frame over roughly the next, at that point, 8 months or so, that God really showed me. He's like, look, you cannot replace Luke. You have this God shaped hole in your hearts.
Do you
And
feel like that's what you guys were trying to do? Like, trying to get pregnant right away again was just kind of cope with that by, like, replacement, I guess?
100%. Yeah. And my wife, I guess, was certainly complicit in that. It does take two to tango, but
100%.
that was me trying to fix, me trying to solve, right?
Yeah.
And so God and my wife were basically like, you can't fix this. We need to put the brakes on this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there was a wedding coming up that fall that my wife definitively did not want to be pregnant at. And so she's like, we need to put the brakes on until after that wedding. And we agreed to do that. And during that period of time, we got involved at the church that hosted the memorial service for Luke because we weren't church going people. And so community made a big difference for us. And inside of community was, or like what that also meant was that the church happened to be hosting a program called Grief Share, which I think is available internationally, but it's kind of a structured, I don't know, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, something along those lines, where you watch some videos and then you discuss things with other people that are grieving. And that was just massively helpful for us to be able to grieve, because what we experienced was we were grouped up with other folks that had child loss. Okay. but we're the only people with a dead baby in that group. We're sitting across the table from like guys like Bill, who Bill's 20-year-old daughter was 15 minutes away from their house when she falls asleep at the wheel and dies on her way back from college. And so we're looking at Bill's grief and his loss going, oh, you had 20 years of relationship. You have 20 years of memories with your daughter. We never even got to hear Luke cry. Like, your loss is way worse than our loss. And he's like, well, your loss is way worse than my loss. And the reason I'm bringing some levity here is because what it revealed to us is that it's all individual. It's all unique. And in the end, it's all painful to its own degree. And just simply talking with others that had experienced similar things, not even the same, just really helped to let the grief out. And that was a big learning for us. The more that we let it out, whether that was through tears, and I'll tell everybody that's listening, man, I didn't cry as an adult up until my son died. And I have been an excellent crier ever since. It's awesome.
You gain a new skill.
Absolutely, man. It's awesome because it just lets stuff out.
Absolutely. No, and I think that's really cool. Finding a community, and I love what you said, like saying that it's individualized. Like we always, I think it's just part of human nature too. Like we always want to compare, right? We want to compare. Oh, my hurt's worse than your hurt, or yours is worse than mine. Or let me equivocate, like what I went through to you went through to try to relate, but also to try to one up you, kind of thing. And it's like there's no one upping in grief, right? And
Yeah.
there's no one upping when it comes to losing your child or how you lose your child or the circumstances around that. Like it's awful for everyone in their circumstances. My dad lost my brother, many years ago. We lost him to an overdose. And so it's something really different, and I wouldn't even say my dad would compare that as like better or worse. He would be like, you know what, your suck sucks and my suck sucks kind of thing. It both
Yeah.
sucks. And there's no comparing that, right? Because it, like you said, it's an individualized process. There's nothing, yours isn't worse than mine and mine isn't worse than yours. We can say, oh man, yours is just way harder than what I went through kind of thing. And vice versa. And that's just, I think, part of human nature. So anyways, back to that fall. So you were engaged in church community, found people who could relate, and then you went to the wedding later that fall that your wife's like,
Yeah.
I do not want to be pregnant at,
Right.
kind of thing. And so, yeah, then what?
Yeah. So then we got pregnant again. Once we decided, hey, we're going to sort of, green light ourselves, if you will, we got pregnant again, blessed in this case to get pregnant right away. And, at this point, we went to a different obstetrics practice and somebody that's kind of specialized in slightly more high risk scenarios, and all kind of proceeded pretty well until the late third trimester, and amniotic fluid was low, and that resulted ultimately in our daughter having to be induced at 37 weeks. So not that early by modern standards, but sort of like early full term. But ultimately, she was delivered successfully and we didn't have any issues there. But it was a little bit of a scare in a sense that it was like, okay, yeah.
Yeah. Was there like fear throughout the pregnancy? Like thoughts of like even early on having experienced miscarriage and I think that's in a unique position. You guys are in a very unique position, like from the very beginning. It's like, okay, we've experienced a miscarriage and we've experienced a full term stillbirth. And so, was there like some fear, some worry, some stress in between? Because I mean, personally, if that was me, I would be stressed about it the whole time and just worried about every little thing happening. And so, what were those conversations like when you were pregnant and going through it?
Yeah. So for sure, man, there was definitely fear, and more of that on my wife's side than on my side. Maybe we'll call that a 60-40 split. You know what I'm saying? Because she's the one actually carrying our daughter. But yeah, we were definitely concerned. There was no doubt about that. It was probably late in the second trimester. So we're probably 6-ish months or so in when during a worship moment at church, okay, like during like kind of like praise and worship, if you will, the Holy Spirit actually spoke to me not audibly, but I knew it was very clear from the Holy Spirit that our daughter was going to be born alive. And that was wonderful, man, because it took the edge off of things. So I think it's really important to be transparent here. It took the edge off. It wasn't like 100%. We know that this is going to occur. And I don't want to sound as if we were not believing, but I also need everybody to realize, like, we are less than a year in, or just over a year into a relationship with Jesus Christ. Like,
Yeah,
we're
no,
still,
you're gonna doubt. I mean, Thomas
you know,
doubted. Okay,
you
Thomas
know,
doubted, and he was
developing and all of that. Yeah.
yeah,
But that helped, and then obviously it played out that way too, which was, really, really quite wonderful. But yeah, it was definitely challenging along the way for that one.
yeah,
And that's also what put us into this position of, we're 70 to 90% never going to have any more kids,
mhm,
because, we've got the fetal demise, which is the technical term for Luke, and the full term stillbirth. We had to induce our daughter early, you know what I mean? Because the challenge is there. And so we're like, maybe we're not going to get in the game with this, but
yeah,
God had other plans on that one.
yeah, and you guys are 30, 32, 33 when your daughter's born,
Mm-hmm.
ish, if I'm putting numbers right. So then fast
Yep.
forward, you guys are 39 and 40 years old when when you find out you're a little, I don't wanna say it was a whoopsies because I don't know if it was intentional or not,
Yeah.
but then you find out she's pregnant again with
Yeah.
twins.
Yeah.
What what went through your guys' head? You know, you guys have been raising your daughter for the past 7 years, so you have a 7-year-old, and I guess technically an 8, 9-year-old if we're counting Luke as well, um, at that same rate. Then these twins are born, or you find out you're pregnant, and what was that like even more?
Yeah. So we just got to rewind the numbers ever so slightly. So we're around our daughter being about 4.5 when my wife and I kind of both get this prompting separately. But we kind of get this prompting of, like, I think we're maybe supposed to try for another baby. And so I talked to my wife about that, and she's like, it's interesting that you bring this up, because I've been feeling like we have an empty seat at the table. And she clarified, she's like, I don't mean replacing Luke, right? Because that was a very real series of conversations that we had as a couple.
Absolutely.
So we went and developed a relationship with a high risk obstetrician, because we lived in a completely different state at this point than where Cora was born. And because we're like now a lot older, and we're like, hey, we actually know a thing or two in life. We should be wise about this. Let us develop a relationship with somebody before we even go down this path. God blessed us with a relationship with a high risk pregnancy specialist right out of the gates that we really felt comfortable with. And then we were just bathing this thing in prayer, Jay. And we both just felt clearly that God was saying to us, try for another baby, right? And for sure, dude, we're like, yeah, this is going to be one baby. Then out of the gates, we got pregnant like we had been able to every other time, which of course was unexpected, but really neat. Based on our mathematics, that would have put us into a scenario where a single baby would have been due in the month of February, because my wife wanted to avoid a baby being born in January. And as it turned out, and you've already mentioned this, right? We end up pregnant with twins. And in the high risk obstetrics world, for a mom who is past the age of 35 with other high risk, elements in there, the OB was like, yeah, they're going to come out at 36 weeks. And that means we're moving the due date from February into January. And my wife was not very happy about that at all, because she wanted to avoid that month. And later in the pregnancy, as we continue to pray about all that, God, through the Holy Spirit, shared with me, he's like, look, you guys tried to control this. You're not in control. I'm in control. I'm redeeming Luke's death by giving you 2 boys. You will celebrate live births in the month of January. They will be born alive. And this was the best part, dude. The Holy Spirit kind of like wraps this little communication to me up with this, and you will tell this story. So I'm like, okay. So I told my wife, I was like, look, Holy Spirit literally told me they're going to be born alive. They're going to be born in January. So you got to knock it off with the OB. And that was it, man. And so towards the end of January, they were born. So our daughter at that point is now 5.5, and it's total elapsed time from Luke's death in January of 2012
Gotcha, okay.
to our son's births in January of 2019. It was 7 years. And
That's
they're
cool.
6 and 12, as you and I sit here and record this.
That's so cool. Wow. What a whirlwind of a 7 years for you guys. I couldn't You guys are absolute, developing a relationship with Jesus and also going through what you guys went through. Did it feel like once the boys were born, did it feel like you guys were, like, getting a new chapter or, like, a new lease or a new, like a new chapter was being written?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it, dude. But let me be really clear for everybody. At the beginning of that chapter, Jay, it was a disaster. Here's what I mean by that. At this point, we are 5.5 years into being parents. And our thinking was, we're solid parents. We're going to be good to go. Because people would say to us, like, oh, you guys going to need any help? And we're like, with all due respect, like, no, we've been here, done that. Like, this is not our first rodeo.
Right.
Okay. And I'm sharing all this transparently just because I think it's important for people to hear what life was like, man. Multiples, Jay, absolutely crushed us. And maybe that was because our expectations were like, we got this, been here, done that. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Been there, done that. It absolutely crushed us. And it was very, very humbling. And in that whole process, man, I met people that I literally had never seen before. They just showed up in my kitchen. My wife like barely knew them, but it was like, hey, I've never seen you before, but there's 2 kids over there and there's 2 bottles on the countertop. Like, can you help? And that's ultimately the reason why they were over there. So it was a real challenge in the first probably 12 months. Most of the naps that our boys took literally lasted 29 minutes. And it was just brutal, to the point that we had some really strong conversations with God about, like, why did it go this way? And we're not proud of that at all, man. But in the whole frustration of it all, God loved us and he was there and he listened to our frustration when we poured out our hearts to him. And he continued to, over time, show us, he's like, yeah, this sucks, but they will be a blessing to you. They don't feel like a blessing right now, but they will be a blessing to you. And then later, they're going to be a blessing to me, meaning him. So it was really, really humbling. And, now that they're older, now that they tie their shoes and read and wipe their own butts and all that kind of stuff, like it's so much easier than what it was. But I mean, it brought us very, very low.
Yeah.
And it was very humbling.
Yeah, and I think God loves to do that. Loves to humble us, and He loves to put us in situations that are really uncomfortable, that we question, that test us. But I think at the same time, like some common things you keep saying, and that I'm picking up on is like you were constantly reminded, like you're not in control. You
That's
are
right.
not the one in control, and I think that's a great reminder for everybody. Like we are not in control. We need to listen. We need to be faithful, and we need to understand like these things are beyond us and there's a bigger purpose, there's a bigger picture going on around us, and we are nothing more than just like a speck on one little drop of paint on that picture at any given time, of all the things going on. And so I think that's really important to remember in all this. I guess, yeah, any more kids planned, or are we shop's closed?
Yeah, shop is closed on that. Praise
Closed.
God.
Good,
Praise
thank
God.
goodness.
Yeah.
All right, so we spent a lot of time on that, but I think that was such an important part of the story here. Mixed into all that, you're in Colorado. You're on a 14,000-foot peak, and you thought it was a good idea to trigger an avalanche. Why did you do that? I'm just kidding. I'm kidding, Mick. I know you didn't do it on purpose. Unless you did, you're like yelling avalanche just to see what has happened. But no, so in that, so that's in Colorado, in between the same 7-year span, right? And so it's
Yeah. So the avalanche is actually predates all of what we've been talking about, but
okay,
the story certainly happened nonetheless.
gotcha. And so part of this, your skull was fractured, your scalp was split open. Then you hiked 3 miles out, bleeding, freezing, barely conscious. Through all of that, how did you survive that?
Yeah. Well, let me briefly just kind of tell that story and color in a tiny bit more than what you've
Definitely.
outlined already. So thank you for doing that. Let's rewind everybody to the year 2000, and we're going to go to November 7th, which for some of the listeners, they'll recall that that was the day of the hanging Chad. That was George W. Bush and Al Gore election day. And that also means that it was a Tuesday. And I am 19 years old, and Jay am a ego and Mountain Dew fueled 6 foot tall little boy. Okay. I'm athletic, I'm strong, I'm capable, but for sure, I'm not a man. And there are two 14,000 foot peaks that are very close to greater Denver, and they're called Gray's Peak and Torrey's Peak. And it's totally common for people to hike them in a single day. So there'll be hundreds and hundreds of people on a Saturday afternoon or Saturday morning in summer hiking both of them. And I had done that exact same thing, and I decided I was going to go do it better. And so I decided I will go climb a snow climb or a snow gully, a snow couloir is what it's specifically called. So think of like what people would ski down as a double black diamond chute at the top of a ski resort or something like
Mhm.
that. So I'm going to climb up that. And it was called the Lost Rat Couloir. My plan was to climb up the Lost Rat Couloir on Gray's Peak, then take the ridge up to the summit, go over to Torrey's Peak, and then back down to the car and be home by dinner, literally home by dinner. And about 200 or so feet up that couloir, up that Lost Rat climb, I triggered an avalanche, and that avalanche swept me to the bottom, and I was unconscious for that entire ride. So I was face in, kind of climbing on all fours. This is not a vertical climb, because remember, this is something that's steep enough that people want to ski down, but it is far beyond a hike in that you need all fours to ascend this slope. And he saw the fracture line. I heard the whoomph of the settling snow, saw the snow sliding towards me. I immediately tried to run, if even possible, perpendicular to the direction that the snow is sliding. And I got 1 foot in that direction and was swept off my feet by the snow. And I remember, Jay, thinking to myself, this is going to suck for my family, especially my mom. And then the lights went out. So I was immediately knocked unconscious. I regained consciousness at the bottom. I have no idea how long I was unconscious. And when I came to, I did sort of like this systems check, like what just happened and what is my status? And it kind of seemed like, man, everything was a go. I knew something was wrong, but on the whole, I'm like, okay, you're functioning, so go. I just had this very clear sense like something's bad, you need to go. So I set out from the bottom of the route to hike the 3 miles back to the trailhead parking lot. Meanwhile, I'm climbing alone. There's nobody else with me. There's nobody else around because this is a Tuesday in winter conditions. And 30 seconds before I walked into the trailhead parking lot, and that elapsed time is probably around an hour and 30 to maybe an hour and 45 minutes that it takes me to get from the bottom of the climb back to the trailhead parking lot in my truck. 30 seconds before I walked into that parking lot, a guy named Steve shows up in his truck, and Steve ends up taking me to the hospital, and all of the King's men put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And the
Hmm.
extent of the injuries that you described were that all of the trauma that occurred in this fall from the avalanche occurs to my head. So my skull was broken in 3 places. My scalp was split from just over my right eyebrow all the way to the back top of my head. So right before your head starts to curve down towards your neck. So I don't know, whatever that is, 10 inches probably, you know? And so as Steve described it, as he was helping me in the parking lot, he said, when we got your Arc'teryx, like Gore-Tex ski jacket off, you know what I mean? Shell jacket off, and took your hood off, he said that for all intents and purposes, my right ear was basically slumped down, sitting on my right shoulder. Like that's how split open I was. And he's like, I was looking at your skull. No doubt about it. So my jaw was also broken on both sides. And as a result of all of the trauma to my head, I had bleeding on my brain and I had swelling of my brain. And so that evening, they moved me into emergency brain surgery to literally drain my head and to relieve the pressure. So they cut me open, literally poured me out. I'm not kidding.
Yeah,
It's pretty wild.
that's
And then I
crazy.
woke up the next day with gauze wrapped around my head and got pictures of all of that. So my jaw was wired shut for 17 days after it was repaired. So that's essentially like the version of casting it so that it can
Mhm.
heal. But after 6 days, I left the hospital, and 3 weeks after the avalanche and the whole accident, I was back to college and back in the workforce.
Wow.
And here's what I can tell you for sure. I was in such a bad state in the parking lot that I couldn't get my jacket off. Okay. There was so much coagulated and frozen blood on my jacket that I couldn't get the zipper down. So at the beginning of this story, I am a strong and capable 19-year-old. A handful of hours later, I'm in such a bad condition that I cannot get my jacket off. Think about that.
Yeah.
So Steve has to help me get my jacket off. And that and the fact that he had to get my key off of my truck, I kept a spare key bolted to underneath of my pickup truck bed. I couldn't get that off either. And I'm highlighting these two things because those are what signaled to me that I was in such bad condition that I needed Steve to take me to the hospital. But moreover, if Steve is not there, I die in that parking lot. No question about it. So that's why it is without question to me a miracle that I survived. To me, the miracle is not that I wasn't buried in the avalanche and was able to walk all the way back to the parking lot, right?
Mhm.
To me, the miracle is Steve shows up 30 seconds
What
before I get to that parking lot.
so did
Otherwise, I'm the dead man.
did you ever find out, like, why Steve was there? Like, what? Because I mean, it's not a coincidence, right? It was meant to be, but man, like, this do you think this was, like, your very first encounter, like, with or I don't know if you were a believer or not, but if you weren't, like, do you think, like, this was your first encounter with, like, God, like, a higher power, kinda, like, setting the stage for what was to come many, many years later?
Yeah, 100%, man. Steve and I have had a handful of conversations since. In fact, on my podcast, When You Look, which you talked about before, we did an episode and he kind of shares the entire story. And in short, he was just looking to drive his relatively new to him Toyota Tacoma in snow. And he just kind of felt prompted to get off of Interstate 70 and drive up this fire road, this dirt road that was covered in snow. And he said, I got about a quarter of a mile up and realized like, this is a really bad idea. And then he's like, so I thought about backing down. And he goes, that seemed like a worse idea. He goes, so I kept going in hopes to find a spot that I could safely turn around. And he ends up continuing to go a full 3 miles up that road. And again, it turns into this trailhead parking lot. And he goes, I got there. And I'm like, wow, there's actually something here. So he puts his jacket on, gets out, sort of looks around, checks out the trailhead signs and such. And then he sees me. So 100%, he had no business being there. Absolutely not a coincidence. Very much kind of like God dispatching him. But
Honestly, yeah.
to answer the other part of your question, Jay, like I had grown up in a quote unquote Christian household. And what I
Mhm.
mean by that is that my parents talked about God and Jesus, but the way they behaved, how they argued, how they fought, how there was so much anger and conflict in my home, I saw this disconnect. I could never articulate it as a kid, but I saw this disconnect between what I was being told and what I was seeing. And so I didn't have a great relationship with my folks. So I rebelled against them. There's that saying that goes, rules without relationship equals rebellion. Well, that was me. They had a lot of rules and we didn't have a great relationship. So I just rebelled hard. And then by extension, I did the exact same thing with this God that I had this intellectual understanding of. Like I knew in my
Mhm.
head, like, who he is, right? But I didn't have any relationship. So as I'm rebelling against my parents, I'm rebelling against all of God's rules, if you will, also. And so what is so wonderful, man, is the fact that, and I did not understand this until just truly a handful of years ago, okay, in my 40s. But God revealed to me a handful of years ago that, dude, when you were 19 and I saved you in that avalanche, he's like, you hated me. And I'm like, absolutely. Yes. Yes, I did. Okay. Make no bones about it. I wanted nothing to do with him. And he goes, when you hated me, I still loved you. And that was huge,
Powerful.
man. Huge.
Yeah.
So
It's powerful.
that is true for everybody that's listening too. Even if we hate him, I'm convinced he still loves us. Seen it in my
Absolutely.
own life.
Absolutely. Well, Mick, what a conversation today. It's been great to hear some parts of your story. The before the kids, while the part of Luke being stillborn, and then the next 7 years, that whole 7 year span, and the aftermath. Many years later now, several years later, God is showing you He's good, right? And I think that's the best part. Let's jump into the dad zone real quick, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So we're going to rapid fire these. We're going to get these through. People say this is their favorite part of the podcast, so it would be a disservice if we didn't jump in here.
Awesome.
Does pineapple go on pizza?
For some people, just not at my house.
Love it. Who are 3 people you'd like to invite over for a dinner party?
King Jesus, if we can count him as a person, although he did walk
Absolutely.
on earth. My son Luke, and probably my brother. I like hanging out with my brother.
Love it. What is your guilty pleasure food?
Chocolate.
Love it. And then what is one piece of advice that you would offer to a new dad, age 18 to 22, just starting out his fatherhood journey?
Rules without relationship equals rebellion. So the advice that I would suggest is create relationship with your children.
Love it. Love it. Your takeaway, I hope you take away from this, with the many that we've talked about, is you don't always get to choose your pain, but you can choose what it points toward. And then your reflection for this week as you go throughout your week, what's the hardest chapter in your story? And can you imagine that God might be using it to write your redemption or to help somebody else later on? And then your action, take 5 minutes tonight, write down the hardest moment in your life and one small way it changed you for the better. Sometimes the miracle starts when you name what broke you. And so with that, you can find more of Mick on Instagram at Mick, Wienheolt. It's also on Facebook as well. And then you can watch the When You Look show on YouTube, which is right here. Don't worry, it's coming, so that you know you're in the right place. You can see Mick's smiling face. It's adorable. Let's see here. So that should pop up on the screen, but you can see all of the When You Look right there on YouTube. This is where Mick brings real, unfiltered conversations about life, loss, and faith that will challenge how you see the world. And so, Mick, huge thank you to you today for sharing your heart, sharing your story with us today. If this episode reminded you of the power of faith, family, and second chances, share it with someone who needs hope right now. And then again, don't forget to subscribe, leave 5 stars, leave a review, and keep the conversation going in the comment. And until next time, keep leading with love, living with faith, and showing up for your people. This is a Young Dad Podcast. Thanks for tuning in.